Well, thanks for that introduction, Ron, and it is my pleasure to contribute to this great series. And I'm going to do a bit of a monologue first, so please excuse me for that. I'm going to try to talk you in about 45 minutes through much of my thesis, which you then have to read, of course, and study all the nitty-gritty details and zillion of footnotes. And I hope we have time for questions afterwards, and you can always email me because I love to talk about this. And there's this spiral, and the spiral is very symbolic for the process I went through writing the thesis, because at the start I knew it was something with Heinrichs and safety and stuff, but what's it going to be? So the symbolism is really nice, I think. But what I wanted to talk about here is the title. There are three elements. The three elements are the key ingredients of this cycle. You have the Heinrich, of course, which I will talk about, and especially his work. Then you have the new view of safety, which has opinions of Heinrich and his work. And in the middle you have local rationality, and I'm going to discuss these three, and they will guide us through several loops. First, a few words about my study. I was in the human factors and systems safety program of Lund University. It's a wonderful program. 2 years. It's really intense, especially the first year, where you have many assignments and you are exposed to a lot of theory and papers and stuff. And then the second year you make write your thesis. And well, what's special about the program, I think, is that many safety educations will try to teach you how to do things. I think the HFSS program mainly learns you to think with the various theories and about the various theories, and see advantages and downsides, and well, maybe make better selection of your tool box. And one quote, I put it here, we got it at the first learning lab we attended, Johan Bergström. He said, pick a position and defend it. And that's kind of a principle. It's not necessarily a right or wrong answer, but you have to, well, argue for why you think that BBS is a good approach in this situation. For example, very hypothetical. Why then thesis about Heinrich? And well, I can talk at length about this. One answer is I've been interested for a long time in the development of knowledge within safety, within our professions, and well, being a good professional. And I think being a good professional, there's an element of interest in where does it come from and what does it mean. And there's this great quote of Carl Weick hidden behind some pictures for me. He says just that a part of professional development is the appreciation of where we come from and questioning it. And the picture here is just one representation of how safety knowledge development can be drawn. This is from Patrick Watterson's work. And I've chosen this one to show how far apart the two ingredients of my thesis are. On the one side, you have the new approaches, 2000s, FRAM, etc., the new view, resilience engineering, and then on the other side of the spectrum, and actually outside of this timeline, is where Heinrich started in the mid-20s. And at some point they meet. For me personally, Heinrich was actually the start of critical thinking in safety, because I don't know if some of you remember, but a few years ago there were some raging debates on LinkedIn about Heinrich's work. And one of these threads in one of the groups that then were still working, it went over, I don't know, 6,000 comments, I think. And one thing that struck me quite early in that discussion was most people, whether they defended Heinrich or criticized his work, they had never read anything by the man. And I decided not to fall in that trap. I happened to have some books of his in the bookshelf. Hadn't read them at the time, but I sat down, read them, and then took part in the discussion. I think that was a really useful lesson for myself. But again, the question, why does this old stuff matter? Shouldn't we get past it by now? And if I do a quick and very dirty literature search and search Scopus, one of the scientific databases on the keyword industrial accident prevention, I look actually for Heinrich's book. You get a very surprising picture. I hope you can see it all for full, because it's the first citation is in 1970, and then it takes us to today. And you see a quite interesting picture, because it doesn't do a thing the first, say, 30 years. It's only after 2000, 2002-ish that it starts to take off. And then it takes off really fast. And if you look 2020, it's the shows till the beginning of June. It has even more than before 2010. And it's an interesting question. Why is this so? Why is this old literature so interesting now still? When some people suggest, well, shouldn't we just leave this in history and forget about it? And there's some, and I'm not going to talk a lot about this picture, but there are some suggestions. One is globalization. You see a lot of papers coming from the East these days that tend to quote Heinrich quite a lot. The other one is all publications go up, show this pattern. There's really an explosion of safety papers, and generally there's much more publication. And whether this is good or not, we can discuss another time. And then there are some factors that are actually connected to Heinrich. One is in 2002 there were two important papers published, or two important documents published. The one by Manuele, who made a book about Heinrich's work, very critical. The other is a great paper by Andrew Hale, who discussed the triangle, Heinrich's triangle, really thoroughly. And I think they have sparked some interest, and you see a slow rise there. And then in 2011, Manuele did a really well-known paper for the magazine of the ASSE at the time, dislodging Heinrich's myths or something. And I think that has super contributed to keeping the discussion going. So it was a quite interesting picture. I just did a random search at some point and I thought, wow, this is really interesting. A few words about why I think that my thesis matters. One thing is I combine two sides of the spectrum of safety knowledge, the really old stuff and the really cutting edge, if we want to call it that way. and well, discuss them both and together. I've also done some real archaeology, and well, added a lot of sources that were hidden in vaults, were literally hidden in archives of Travelers Insurance Company. And I have a little picture at the right where you see the knowledge base of the various, of some discussions of Heinrich works. The first is Fred Manuel's book, and he has done 2 versions, updated in 2014, and he bases his work on just the 4 books by Heinrich, which is 1 book in 4 different versions. That's his basis. Then there's this team of Dutch safety scientists, led by Paul Swuste, who has done some really great papers between 2009 and 2014, and they are now working on a book about safety history to be published late this year or early next year. It's going to be a very recommended piece of work. I've read the Dutch version. Anyway, they do some thorough discussions of Heinrich and Heinrich's contribution, and you see they have a much richer base. They used a couple of papers published by the National Safety Council, for example, and some other sources. And then the bottom one, that's mine, and well, I went really deep in, and the people at Travelers and some other people were really helpful, getting me a lot of primary Heinrich sources. So I think there's a really rich basis to discuss his work and try to make sense of his work too. And that's the next point. Instead of criticizing, because criticizing is very easy, I think, we can just be on our high horses and say, these people in the 30s, they knew nothing, absolutely nothing, and look what terrible stuff they wrote. I decided to employ a different approach and try to understand why did they write, how they wrote, and what does it lead to, what has it led to. So I try to give a critical look at safety science. That's the outline. I don't spend time, but we are going to have basically 3 rounds. Who are these various elements? What do they do? What do they say about each other? And then the end. Why does it make sense to all these people? And all of this super fast, so hang on. First, a few words. Who was Heinrich? He lived a long time ago, and most of his life he worked for an insurance company since 1911, if I recall well, and most of the time he was one of the important middle managers. And he never got a top function, which probably was in his advantage because he had time to do a lot of stuff at the side. He spoke on many occasions. He was an author who wrote a lot. He was a teacher at universities and practitioner courses, and he did a lot of committee work in the war, before the war, in the Great Depression, and afterwards. And he has been super influential, because I think you will have a hard time going into a safety course and not hearing something that has been influenced by his work. And he has received some serious critique lately. A few words about his work. The picture shows his best known book, Industrial Accident Prevention, but he did a lot on this besides that. I have been able to uncover some 50-ish papers, not all of them safety, most of them, partly management and some technical stuff. He was an engineer, a boiler engineer by well, not education, but that's where he started. He has done some management books. That was a real surprise for me, but then again it makes a lot of sense if you read his work, because we tend to see industrial accident prevention as a safety book, when in fact it's also a management book. It's mostly a management book, and he says it in the summary. He writes this stuff mainly for top managers, which was quite interesting, because we open the book and we think, oh, this is a how-to book for safety. It's not really. It's a book how managers can do safety. And it's very important to understand where he comes from and what he does. Yes, and he's done some other stuff. And then the thing about the critique, and I think this is the harshest I've been able to find. Maybe you've seen the piece before, and I love Phil. He writes great stuff, and sometimes he pushes it well. And I think this is an interesting. This was an interesting piece. Where he puts Heinrich side by side with the Holocaust, and makes some allegations about eugenics and stuff. And what I found interesting here is the quote here: "Battle lines are being drawn and it's time to choose a side." And that's explicitly what I not wanted to do with my thesis. So my thesis doesn't say whether Heinrich was right or wrong, and I do point at some point I say there's some stuff that I find difficult, and there's other stuff that I find amazing. But I try to be as neutral as I can and just try to understand what he did. And then there's the new view. Now we had Heinrich, we go over to ingredient 2, the new view. I hope most of you have some sense of what it is, because I'm not going to discuss it in detail. But I chose two and a half approaches to decide in my thesis what people and what work I was going to discuss and to review to get some sense of what they say and why they say it. One is by characteristics, and I took this table here. I think it's from a 2002 or 2004 paper by Sidney Dekker, where he discusses the old view and new view, and this table is focused on human error. Like the old view, traditional safety sees human error as a cause of trouble, and we see that very much in Heinrich, because we certainly all heard that Heinrich at one point said that 88% of all accidents are caused by man failure. So that fits very well. The new view has another much more nuanced and a more positive view on an error. And so there I made a list of characteristics to find literature there. Then there are of course some obvious orders that I included, and some examples to the left: Dekker, Holnagel, Conklin. Very vocal. Robert Long, I don't know who of you knows his work, Australian guy. He wouldn't call himself the new view, but I thought he belongs in that group because of where he comes from and what he teaches. And then I selected also people that associate themselves with things like HOP or safety differently, etc. So that was my basis, and I found quite some documentation there to go through and see what do they think of Heinrich and how do they describe his work. And then there's ingredient number 3, and that's local rationality. And this is very important, I think, and you can forget everything else I say today, but please remember local rationality. I think that's one of the most important things that we can teach people in safety. Try to take a local rationality point of view. And it's based on, or it's derived from Nobel Prize winner Herbert Simon, who at some point started discussing bounded rationality, because he said situations, they are so complex that the human brain isn't capable of full rationality at all. We speak about rationality, but we can't be fully rational because we cannot understand, we cannot grasp all the elements, all the interactions, and make sense of them. So the situation is much more complex than we can, and we only can be rational about a part of it, the part we manage to cope. Phrasing local rationality a bit simpler is, why do things make sense to people when they do them, given their knowledge, experience, objectives, conflicts, resources, etc., etc. All those things. Why does it make sense to them? Not why does it make sense to us, who look at stuff afterwards, but why does it make sense to them at the time? And a word of caution. This is an approach that's really meant to make sense of behavior and events. And I'm using it in my thesis a bit differently. I use it to make sense of safety theory, of safety texts. That's not what it was designed for, but that was an interesting experiment to see does this work. And I just want to give you this brilliant quote by Jens Rasmussen. If you don't understand why it made sense for people to do what they did, it's not because they were behaving weird, it's because our perspective is maybe not right. Because we look from the outside instead from their inside, because we're not trying to be in their shoes. So, forget the rest. Do not forget this. I think it's really important, and it's very helpful in our everyday work and life. Try to take the local rationality point of view. Then, just a quick view at what Heinrichs did, and yeah, there's way too much to discuss here. So I'm not going through this whole list here. One thing that's really interesting is we've probably seen pictures or things from Heinrichs' work, and then we say, well, Heinrich came up with this idea. He did not. It was really well, kind of a discovery for me because I went and looked into his sources and where he did come from. What his context was, and very much of what he wrote was already there. So what he really did was making a best of. In his book, Industrial Accident Prevention is actually a best of safety knowledge at the time. And as Dan Peterson wrote in his first book, Heinrich produced a unified framework. So Heinrich did not come up with all the ideas. He selected good ideas, he added some stuff to them himself, and then he put them together in a framework that really worked well, and worked well for both managers and workers and safety professionals and a lot of other people. So I think that explains some of his popularity. And then he did something really brilliant, which we might take as an example maybe sometimes. He added some candy to it, because he came up with some great metaphors. He added some numbers, which made them very memorable. And he explained things really good with principles, with short lists. Remember, this was a management book, so he had 4-point list, do this, plan, do, check, act-ish. Really easy to remember and really practical to use. And well, he had some main themes in which he moved. Not going to discuss them now. But I want to show you some of his really iconic pictures. This is the first. This is probably also the worst. Fred Manuele said at some point, or has said it several times, and I agree. This is probably the idea that has done most damage to safety work. Because Heinrich called this the origin of accidents. It was a study he and his people did, and they found out within a group 75,000 accidents, 2% are not preventable. The other 98% we can divide in 88% caused by humans, direct cause, proximate cause, 10% by mechanical conditions. And so people drew the conclusion, oh, so we need to focus on behavior, on the human. And that has misguided a lot of safety work. We just can say that. I won't discuss now whether this was or was not Heinrich's intention. Well, it was not, but I'm not going to explain the why and how of this. But this is one of the things that is really known for the 88-10-2 ratio. Here's the other iconic idea, and this was quite groundbreaking at the time, because Heinrich suggests with the triangle, the pyramid, or whatever you want to call it, by focusing on stuff that did go well, you can possibly prevent the bigger accidents, or accidents with bigger outcomes. And this is an idea that was not really much around at the time yet. So I think if there's one contribution that is really Heinrichs, apart from the pictures, it's this idea of being more proactive than reactive. Do not wait for the big bang. You can actually often do something before, because you can be able to observe some stuff. It's more complicated than that, but this is the idea. This is his other super iconic idea, accident as a process. It was actually not his idea. That was Louis Dubois of DuPont, who divided an accident in several phases and separated causes from the event from the outcome. But Heinrich, he made this eye candy. He made the dominoes and, picture that is really memorable and really easy to explain to people who have no idea of causation. You push one domino and the chain goes. Has a lot of drawbacks also, not going into those, but this was one of his really important contributions. And then there's this one, not as known as the other ones, but I think I want to show it anyway, because I think this is a really cool representation of a safety management system really early. This is from 1950 when he presented it, and it shows more or less the structure for how you can make a safety management system. You have at the bottom some kind of mission, vision, policy. You build your organization on it with responsibility, accountability, and all the support. And then you build a program that builds on facts, study the stuff, make improvements, and follow up. So I think this is really groundbreaking at the time. But, it's not as known as all the other stuff from him. So that was a all too quick introduction into what Heinrich did. And what does the new view say? And I'm not going to do a lot of detail and quotes here. Just some general observations. They are quite negative, most of them. Some very nuanced. Eric Holnagel, for example, as you see that Eric has a lot of luggage from safety history and knowledge from early safety. So he talks very balanced, I think. Others are much harsher. And then there is a general tone of, well, all this old stuff, let's just forget it, file it, and delete it from our curriculum. And then there are some reasons to do so, and they are often furnished in some kind of attributions. Heinrich, I mentioned some of the more important here. Heinrich is attributed being behind the idea of zero, for example, something that Sidney Decker discusses in Safety Anarchist, for example. And let me just go back a few steps, because Heinrich was nothing of the sort. If you look at this picture, he says, okay, 98% of accidents are preventable, which is close to 100, but he says a lot in his stuff, but in reality we should be happy if we do 50, because that's what we really managed to do. So Heinrich was never pushing for zero. On the contrary. Fixed ratios about the triangle must always be in that ratio of 129 300. People attribute lagging indicators to his work. Safety bureaucracy is attributed to his work. He is linked to behaviorism because of the 88% of all accidents are caused by humans, and he is often linked, probably because of the age, to Taylorism, scientific management, one best way, etc. And so I went to look how does this match. Having read a lot of Heinrich's work and his backgrounds, seeing what New View people say and how the New View positions itself, how do these things actually match? And there was a really interesting observation when it comes to discussing Heinrich and also other stuff. The New View suddenly stops being New View, and they adopt what they would call an old view approach in discussing Heinrich's work. Because the New View promotes doing rich stories about incidents, looking for context, going in depth, not cherry picking, having multiple stories, etc., etc. Refrain from normative statements, etc. But they do so when they discuss Heinrich and James Reason, also a bit, and some other. But especially Heinrich, and so it didn't match at all. Somehow they preach something in their work, but don't apply it not to everything. And only rarely I found local rationality perspective. Eric Holnagel, again, he does it 2 times, I think, that he explains why did Heinrich use a really simple model as the dominoes, which Holnagel finds insufficient to describe accidents and causation, but it made sense at the time. He explains this. Then there was the other question, how do these judgmental, cherry-picked attributions match to Heinrich's work, having studied them in depth? And my conclusion was, well, nearly all of them lack substance. They don't go into depth, and most of them are really easy to refute. For example, by just watching that one picture I showed you, and he doesn't say so. and also Taylorism and Heinrich and BBS, they're not going to spend time on it here, but it's not the case. It looks like it, but it's something different. And then there are a lot of quotation errors. I did one quotation here at the bottom. I think that's quite interesting, because we tend to believe, I believe the two, that Heinrich, because of his statement 88% of all accidents are attributable to main failure, that therefore we have to focus on behavior. But many times he says, as it says here, although main failure is the proximate cause, so it's just the thing that happened before an accident, that does not mean that focusing on that cause will solve your problem. He said that the remedy, so the solution, is often changing the environment, not changing the human, change the environment, which is quite, well, new view, I think. So, why did this make sense to Heinrich? And in my thesis I picked out 3 subjects which I discussed then, and there were many more candidates. I decided to discuss science, because that's one of the things Heinrich tends to get a lot of criticism for. He subtitled his book A Scientific Approach, and then there are people who say, yeah, but he doesn't follow the scientific method at all, and we can't replicate his study, and his data is unavailable, etc., etc. So there's a lot of criticism on the science bit, and sure, what Heinrich did was not science as we know today. But why would it make sense to him to call it that way? 3 suggestions here, and I have a much richer discussion in the thesis or in the book that's coming. One is he followed a systematic approach. So while he didn't science as such, and then remember, he did this in the 20s, not in the 2020s. He followed a really structured approach, and he advocated a structured approach to safety based on facts, not just jumping to any one safety measure that we like, but he advocated look at what happened and build your measurements on facts. And that's what he called scientific. And there's this other thing. I think the science bit was a bit of a sales pitch, because if I'm going to sell washing powder or toothpaste, it is best practice to have someone on screen in a white coat, looking like a scientist, doing something with stuff, and it sells really well. And I think all the scientific gadgetry he applied, the numbers, etc., the ratios, it's very much a matter of persuading people. Just showing, okay, this is the general picture, here are some numbers, and if you add numbers to it, people will take it much more seriously, especially business managers. So he was a good salesman, I think. So that's science. Then there's this thing that has been bugging me personally for many years. Why? Because when I first read Heinrichs' book, I thought, why in the world would he focus on direct causes? Because I've been educated in safety in the 90s. We were taught you should focus on underlying causes, not direct causes. Direct causes are just symptoms of something else going wrong, blah blah blah. But Heinrich, he chooses to go for direct causes. And it was very strange to me, and I thought, would be interesting to have a chat with the man. impossible, but studying his work, he actually discusses and he tells some stuff that suggests why it would make sense to him to do so. And one of the most important reasons is, again, what I said, his book was a management book, and he writes firstly for managers. And he wants to give managers who have a lot of other objectives and a busy day, etc., and don't know the first thing about safety, something handy to solve their problems with. And that's one reason, one of several reasons why he would go for the dire cause. Third element I selected for a discussion was he talks a lot about real causes early on in his work. And on previous sessions here we have talked about constructs and constructivism, and I think for people who have adopted a constructive view, real causes are no such thing as possible. Because a cause is by definition subjective, and there can't be a real cause. It's what you choose as a cause to solve your problems. So you can't find something that is real or true or whatever. And yet Heinrich uses it in his first book, I think 110 times or something, I counted. Why on earth would he do that? And he has two reasons for it, and I'm trying to do a short version of it. The first is he tried to make clear that his view was the new view of the time, and he proposed improved view of causes. Everybody else at the time, they talked about causes and then attributed stuff to the machine or to the process, or they named the incident himself. He, as you saw in the domino sequence, he had the separation of an event and with outcomes and stuff that came before. And he actually tried people to educate in making that separation better. The event is one thing, I fall, but there are causes like slippery floor or whatever. The fall itself is not the cause, it's the cause of the injury, but it's not the cause of the event. So that's, he just used this as a label. Connected to that, he had another idea, namely he thought if you have what he called the real cause, if you reverse the cause, you had a solution. So what he labeled a real cause then should be able to give a hint at what you should do. If you had a cause, well, I got injured, I fell, yeah, don't fall, yeah, okay, that's a solution, thank you. But if you want a concrete solution, you would need something like, well, make a not slippery floor, clean up the oil, have a surface with enough friction, get a handrail or whatever. So that's where I try to make sense of Heinrich. Just the examples I used in my thesis. And then of course there was the exercise, why does all this make two new view authors not doing what they actually preach? So I tried to make sense of that too, and I have three suggestions. The first one is one really strong pedagogical tool is to provide contrast. Talk about things in black and white manner. It's very powerful to make a point. You lose a lot of nuance, but you get your point across very well. And by contrasting what's new, as Decker did in these tables, in the field guide, I think he has 5 or 6 of these tables where he puts the old and the new side by side. Those differences are really good to show where you are different. Even though you may paint a cartoonish paper of what the other side may look like, because it's just your view or just the elements you've picked out. So that's one. It's well, to communicate, which the new view used at some point. Then I think there's the matter of timing. This picture here at the bottom shows the sources I used in my thesis, the new view sources, and you see that there's a sudden rise in interest in Heinrich. There's Hale, he's the red dots. He has been interested in Heinrichs' work for a long time, since the late 1990s, and he tends to use it to contrast his various excellent models. He has this division in linear sequential models, pathological, I think, the more complex ones, and then the really complex ones. He has these three, and he always uses the dominoes as the prototype of the linear ones. He has been doing this for a long time, and then suddenly Decker, who has been writing for a decade, starts discussing Heinrich, which comes really out of the blue. He did two editions of the field guide without any mention of Heinrich, and then suddenly he discussed for some pages, and I was wondering why. And I asked him, and Sydney said, well, this was my move to Australia, and I was confronted with Heinrich, etc., etc. And I think that's surely one part of it. But I think there's actually more to it. If you look at the timing, it's also when Safety Differently and Safety 2 and HOP began becoming a thing from 2012 on, and then all these new people, or many of you people, started discussing Heinrich. And I think it's actually a kind of tribal thing. Position ourselves as a movement, and nothing is better for a movement than having a common enemy. And Heinrich is the flagship of the old view of traditional safety, because his symbols, his metaphors, his teaching, it's all through traditional safety. And I think it's a bit like punk was in the late 70s. Punk music came, and Pink Floyd and then all the other big acts, well, they were suddenly shit, and we have to go against them. I think it's a bit of that. That's that. Some conclusions, trying to wrap up. One of those is, and this may be no surprise for anybody, but if you have a good idea, you can almost be certain that someone else will do something with it that you had never anticipated or imagined. Which is good, and it's also bad. And I think in Heinrich's case, we see a lot of his ideas being hijacked and used by others, and then, well, we lose track. Was it Heinrich who said that the triangle had to be used that way, or did he actually mean something else? So that's one. The second conclusion, really important one that we should keep in mind when we are reading stuff. Discourse and language matter in theory and professional literature. So it's not just what is said, it's also how is it said, what is unsaid, etc., etc. This is a little paragraph from my thesis, and I think this is also just a very important message. If we critique stuff, or we read critique of stuff, we have to remember that it's one story that we tend to read. And if you tell that story, if you critique, you have a choice how to tell it and what part of it to tell. So there's safety theory does have a lot of ethics in it. Yeah, it's not always just progress and science that plays there. There can also be other goals, for good and bad. I think my work also showed that exploring rationality is useful, not only when it comes to accident investigation or event investigation or trying to make sense of behavior. I think it's very useful if you read stuff and look at, well, why does it make sense? Because we just suspend judgment. And I've done a lot of exploring into behavior-based safety last year, just to study, and I came in very negative, but I tried to, well, put myself, why would it make sense for Geller to write stuff like he does? And I think that helps trying to understand and gives a deeper understanding of the stuff. And I still can disagree with him. So, yes, and final point, it's probably not a surprise either. Primary sources are really essential if you want to get a really good picture and really discuss stuff critically. Because secondary or later stuff, it may be affected so much already that it's really hard to build an argument on that. And it may be really hard to get primary sources. Let's be clear about that. Sometimes it's really impossible. And I've come to the end. You can download it from the Lund University website if you want to read the whole stuff. And at the moment I'm working on a book on Heinrich where we'll discuss all of his work as much as the publisher allows me to, and discuss several of the things I have not discussed, like all those ratios, and there will be some critical discussion there. So look forward to that if you want.